Imagine looking up at the sky one morning and noticing something is wrong. Not gone, not eclipsed, just wrong. The sun is there, hanging in its usual place, but it's pale, weak, almost apologetic. It casts no real shadows. It gives no real warmth. And this doesn't last for a day or a week. It lasts for 18 months. That's what people across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia experienced in the year 536 AD. Contemporary writers described a sun that had lost its strength, a light that seemed filtered through smoke or dust, though no fires had been reported nearby. Crops failed in the fields. Snow fell in places and seasons where it had never fallen before. Summer temperatures dropped so sharply that some regions never really felt like summer at all. Harvests collapsed, food ran short, and people who had no way of understanding what was happening to their sky were left to wonder if the world itself was ending. Here's the question that should stop you in your tracks. How does one single year, one disruption in the sky, ripple out to affect societies on completely different continents who had no contact with each other, no shared language, no way of comparing notes? How does a dimmed sun over the Mediterranean connect to strange happenings recorded in Chinese chronicles thousands of miles away? That's the mystery we're going to sit with tonight. For a long time, historians treated these old accounts the way you'd treat any old exaggeration. Interesting, maybe worth a footnote, but probably embellished. A rhetorical flourish. Ancient writers loved a good dramatic sky. But that skepticism has been quietly falling apart over the last few decades, and especially in just the last few years, scientists working with ice cores pulled from Greenland and Antarctica, with tree rings preserved in forests across Europe and Asia, have found something that changes the whole conversation. The evidence in the ice, in the wood, in the frozen chemistry of the past lines up almost perfectly with what those ancient writers described. Something really did happen to the sky in 536. And it really did last far longer than anyone expected. Tonight, we're going to move slowly through this story. No rushing, no urgency, just a calm walk through one of the strangest and most quietly devastating years in recorded history. We'll look at the volcanic theories, the frozen records that scientists have spent years piecing together, the famines that followed, and the empires that were forced to adapt to a world that had quite literally gone dim. Before we go further, if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, I'd love to know where in the world you are and what time it is right there with you. Drop a comment. It's honestly one of my favourite parts of making these. Imagining someone drifting off in Sydney at sunrise, while someone else is just settling in for the night in Lisbon. And if you want the easiest way to support what I do here, following the show on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review if you're enjoying it makes a bigger difference than you'd think. The link is right there in the description. Now, let's go back. Back to a sky that simply stopped behaving the way a sky should. So why this year? Out of all the years in all the centuries of recorded human history, why does 536 AD keep coming up again and again in conversations about the worst possible time to be alive? It's a fair question and it deserves an honest answer, not a dramatic one. Because the truth is, 536 wasn't uniformly catastrophic for every single person on the planet. There were almost certainly villages that had a fine year, farmers somewhere who got lucky with local weather patterns, children born that year who grew up, lived long lives, and never once connected their own hardships to some strange dimming of the sun. History rarely delivers universal suffering evenly across every corner of the globe. What makes 536 extraordinary isn't that it was equally miserable for everyone everywhere. It's that so many different, unconnected societies, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles of unmapped wilderness, all seem to register the same disruption at roughly the same time. That kind of geographic reach is rare. That's what earns a year a reputation. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. When people talk about 536, they're often talking about two different things without quite realizing it. There's the initial event, the sudden darkening of the sky, the pale sun, the strange atmospheric haze that seemed to arrive almost overnight and left contemporary observers reaching for words like portent and omen. That was the shock, the moment when something clearly, visibly changed. But then there's the crisis that followed, the years that stretched from 536 into the early 5040s, a slow-motion unravelling of harvests, temperatures and social stability that didn't announce itself with the same drama but did far more lasting damage. The sky event was the spark, what came after was the fire that kept burning, quietly, for the better part of a decade. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because we're not just talking about a single environmental hiccup, we're talking about a cascade. Cooler temperatures meant shorter growing seasons. Shorter growing seasons meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant less grain in storage, which meant higher prices, which meant hunger among people who were already living close to the edge in ordinary years. And hunger doesn't stay contained. It pushes populations to migrate in search of better conditions. It weakens immune systems just as diseases find new opportunities to spread. It strains the fragile political and economic systems that hold empires together. Environmental disruption and social disruption aren't separate stories here. They're the same story, told in different languages, one written in tree rings and ice, the other written in famine records, tax complaints, and desperate letters between rulers who didn't understand what was happening to their world. Now, how do we actually know any of this? This is where things get interesting, because historians have essentially two different kinds of evidence to work with, and for a long time they didn't fully trust each other. On one side you have written testimony, monks, chroniclers, court officials, ordinary observers who put pen to parchment and described what they saw. A sun that gave no warmth, snow falling out of season, crops that simply refused to grow. This kind of evidence is vivid. It's human, it carries the emotional weight of people who genuinely believed their world was ending. But it's also subjective. Ancient writers weren't scientists. They exaggerated. They interpreted through the lens of religion and superstition. So, for centuries, these accounts were treated with a healthy dose of suspicion. On the other side, you have physical climate records. Ice cores pulled from glaciers that have been slowly accumulating layers of frozen atmosphere for thousands of years. Tree rings that grow thick in warm, healthy seasons and painfully thin during years of cold and stress. These records don't have opinions, they don't exaggerate for dramatic effect. They simply record what happened, chemically and biologically, whether anyone was watching or not. And what's remarkable, what's honestly a little chilling, is how closely these two very different kinds of evidence now line up. The written panic of 6th century witnesses and the quiet, patient data locked inside ancient ice and ancient wood are telling the same story from two completely different directions. Over the course of this video, we're going to walk through both. We'll look at what the Mediterranean world experienced, the empire of Justinian struggling under a sky that refused to cooperate. We'll travel north to Britain and Scandinavia, where archaeological evidence suggests something close to societal collapse in some regions. We'll head east toward China and Central Asia, where independent chronicles describe their own version of the same strange, dimmed years. Each region tells its own piece of the puzzle, and none of them knew about the others. That's precisely what makes reconstructing this moment in history so compelling and so strange. A single disruption felt in fragments across a world that had no way of knowing it was all connected. The first and most famous witness was a man named Procopius. He was not a farmer watching his fields fail. He was not a monk recording omens in some remote monastery. Procopius was a lawyer, a historian, and for a time the close companion of one of the most important generals in the Roman world. He travelled through the eastern Mediterranean. He saw emperors, armies, sieges, and political disasters at very close range. And when he wrote about the year 536, he paused to describe something so strange that even centuries later the sentence feels unsettling. He wrote that during that year a most dread portent took place. The sun, he said, gave forth its light without brightness. It was like the moon, and it remained that way for almost the entire year. Think about what that means in practical terms. Not total darkness, not some dramatic eclipse where day suddenly turns to night and then returns a few minutes later. Procopius was describing something more exhausting than that. A day after day dimness. The sun still rose. You could see its pale disk in the sky. But it did not look right. It did not shine with its usual force. It did not seem to provide the warmth people expected from summer. For people in the 6th century, the sun was not an object in a science textbook. It was the rhythm of existence. It marked work, prayer, planting, travel, harvest, and the passing of the seasons. A strange sun was not merely unusual weather, it was a warning written across the sky. And Procopius did not present it as a private curiosity. He connected the dimness to fear. He wrote that people expected war, plague, or some other disaster to follow, which, unfortunately, is exactly what much of the next decade seemed to bring. Now, historians have to be careful here. Procopius was a skilled writer, but he was also a man of his time. He loved dramatic moments. He wrote history in a tradition shaped by older Greek and Roman authors, where unusual natural events could signal the moral disorder of the age. A comet, an eclipse, an earthquake, a blood-red moon. These were never just physical events, they were narrative events. They told readers that the world had slipped out of balance. So when Procopius calls the dim sun a dread portent, we should not assume he was calmly measuring atmospheric visibility with a modern instrument. He was interpreting what he saw. He was trying to explain it using the intellectual tools available to him. And those tools included divine warning, fate, omen, and cosmic disorder. But here is the important part. The strangeness of his language does not mean he invented the sky. In fact, the detail that makes Procopius useful is also the detail that makes the account hard to dismiss. He does not simply say that the year was terrible. He gives a specific observation. The sun had light, but no brightness. It looked, in effect, like the moon. That is an odd image, a very particular image, and it becomes much more significant when other writers who had their own agendas and their own literary habits begin describing a world that also seemed wrong. One of them was Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman living in Italy. Cassiodorus had spent much of his life near power. He served the Ostrogothic kings who ruled Italy after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He was a man of letters, a bureaucrat, and eventually a Christian scholar. He was also someone who understood that weather mattered. Governments depended on grain, armies depended on grain, cities depended on grain. When the natural order stumbled, politics usually stumbled right behind it. In a collection of official letters associated with the Gothic court, Cassiodorus described an atmosphere that had become deeply unnatural. He wrote of a year in which the sun's rays were weak. The sky seemed to lose its familiar colours. The seasons no longer behaved as they should. There was cold when warmth was expected, and a sense that the ordinary boundaries between spring, summer, autumn, and winter had blurred. His descriptions are almost dreamlike. He speaks of the sun taking on a bluish colour, of shadows at noon seeming faint, of a sky that appeared veiled or clouded for long periods. He described fruits failing to ripen properly and weather behaving in ways that seemed to deny all experience. Again, we have to slow down. Cassiodorus was not writing a personal diary. These were polished official letters, composed in an elaborate rhetorical style. Roman writers were trained to make language rich, formal and memorable. They used nature as metaphor constantly. A bad season could reflect bad government. A clear sky could symbolize justice. A storm could stand in for political chaos. It is possible that some of Cassiodorus's language was heightened for effect. But he was also writing to people who lived under the same sky. He could not simply make up a blue sun or a cold summer if everyone around him knew the weather had been ordinary. His audience would have recognized the reference. The rhetoric works because it seems to have been anchored in something real. And that is the pattern we keep finding, not one dramatic account. Not one frightened witness. Several reports from different corners of the Mediterranean world describing a disruption that was visible enough to become public knowledge. The Syriac chronicler John of Ephesus wrote that the sun became dark and that its darkness lasted for a year and a half. He described sunlight so weak that fruit did not ripen, and wine tasted like sour grapes. That particular detail may sound almost too perfect. Ancient chroniclers often shaped events into moral lessons, yet it is also exactly the kind of thing people notice when growing conditions fail. Not an abstract temperature anomaly, not a graph, fruit that never sweetens. Grapes that do not mature, food that looks normal enough but carries the wrong taste of a broken season. Other chronicles from the Eastern Roman world also mention a dimmed sun, a strange haze or unseasonable cold. They do not all use the same words. They do not all agree on duration. One writer says a year, another suggests longer. One emphasizes the appearance of the sun. Another emphasizes harvest failure. This is not the neat, identical testimony of witnesses who compared notes. It is messier than that, and in a strange way the messiness makes it more believable. Real disasters are remembered differently by different people. A soldier remembers the cold march. A court official remembers grain shortages. A priest remembers frightened crowds in church. A farmer remembers whether the wheat headed, whether the grapes ripened, whether there was enough hay for animals through winter. Nobody sees the whole event. They see the piece of it that enters their life. The 6th century writers also had no concept of volcanic aerosols drifting through the stratosphere. They did not know that particles high above the clouds could scatter sunlight, cool the surface, and tint the sun an unfamiliar colour. They had no vocabulary for a global climate shock. What they had was a sky behaving like it had forgotten its own rules. And when the heavens broke their rules, people looked for meaning. For Christians in the Roman world, celestial disorder could be read as a sign of divine anger, a warning to repent, or a reminder that earthly kingdoms were temporary. The Bible was full of cosmic language. The sun darkened, the moon turned to blood, stars falling, heaven and earth shaken. A dimmed sun could feel like prophecy becoming visible. For others, the old classical language of omens was still alive. Romans had long believed that unusual events in nature might reveal a disturbance in the relationship between humans, gods, and fate. An eclipse, a comet, a monstrous birth, an earthquake, a failed harvest. None of these had to mean exactly one thing, but they meant the world was speaking, and wise people were supposed to listen. That belief could make ancient sources sound more dramatic than modern readers expect, but it could also make people unusually attentive. If the sun looked pale for weeks or months, if summer was cold, if shadows looked wrong at midday, people noticed. They discussed it, they recorded it, they carried the memory into letters, chronicles, and histories. So we should not read Procopius and Cassiodorus as if they were weather stations. They were not, but we also should not wave them away as superstitious storytellers. They were observers, living through something they could not explain, describing it in the only language they had. And the more sources historians place beside one another, the clearer the outline becomes. Sometime round 536, people across the Mediterranean saw a sun that seemed diminished. They experienced seasons that seemed unreliable. They sensed, before anyone could prove it, that this was not just another bad year. Something had entered the sky. The question was what? And that question becomes even more unsettling when we leave the Mediterranean behind, because the strange sky was not remembered only in Italy, Constantinople, and Syria. Versions of the same disturbance appear far beyond the old Roman world, scattered through Irish annals, Chinese court histories, Middle Eastern chronicles, and records from Northern Europe and East Asia. They do not form one perfect story. They were written in different languages, using different calendars for different audiences. Some were copied centuries after the events they describe. Some are brief enough to fit in a single line, but together they suggest that whatever happened around 536 was not a local cloud bank over the Mediterranean. It was something much larger, something that reached across much of the northern hemisphere. Start at the far western edge of Europe, in Ireland. The Irish annals are among the most important written records from early medieval Europe. They are terse, almost brutally so. A king dies, a battle is fought. A monastery is founded, a plague arrives. Then occasionally a line appears that seems small at first, but becomes enormous when you think about what it means. For the years around 536, Irish annalists recorded a failure of bread. That phrase has a plain, heavy meaning. Grain had failed. Bread, the foundation of daily life, had become scarce. It does not necessarily mean every field in Ireland died at once. It does not prove that every family starved, but it tells us that something went wrong badly enough and widely enough to enter the historical memory. In some versions of the annals, the failure continued for several years, from 536 into 539. Imagine being told that the harvest was poor, then being told the next harvest was poor too. Then another. A single failed harvest is a crisis. A sequence of failures can unravel an entire society. Stored grain runs out. Seed grain gets eaten because hungry people cannot afford to save it for planting. Livestock are slaughtered because there is not enough fodder to feed them through winter. Prices rise. The poorest people sell tools, land, animals, anything they own. And when the next planting season comes, they have less seed, fewer animals, and less strength to begin again. But even here we have to be careful. The annals as we have them were compiled and copied over long periods. Their dates were not recorded with the kind of neat precision modern historians would prefer. Some entries may have shifted by a year or two as scribes worked through complicated chronological systems. And failure of bread is an outcome, not an explanation. It does not tell us whether the problem was frost, drought, endless rain, disease in crops, war, or some combination of all of them. Still, when Irish reports of failed bread are placed beside accounts of a dimmed sun and cold summer elsewhere, they begin to look less isolated, not proof by themselves, but one piece of a larger pattern. Now travel east across Europe, across the steppes, toward China. Chinese historical records are different from the annals of Ireland in almost every way. Imperial China had bureaucrats, court scholars, official calendars, astronomical offices, and a long tradition of recording unusual events in the heavens and on the earth. Eclipses, comets, floods, droughts, earthquakes, strange mists, untimely frosts. These things mattered because the emperor's rule was understood to depend on harmony between heaven and earth. If heaven seemed disturbed, officials paid attention. The Chinese sources for the mid-6th century describe years marked by unusual weather, crop failure, famine, and cold conditions in places where cold arrived at the wrong time. Some records from northern China refer to frost and snow during seasons when fields should have been growing. Others describe widespread hunger and hardship in a society dependent on grain harvests. That was not background misery. It was a warning that the seasonal system itself had broken down. Again, not every entry can be pinned confidently to one exact month in our calendar. Chinese records were dated by rain years, lunar months, and cyclical systems of counting days. Converting those dates into modern years is possible, but it is not always simple. A report assigned to 536 in one reconstruction may overlap with late 535 or early 537 in another. And China was not one weather station. Conditions in the north could be very different from conditions in the south. But that is actually part of what makes these records valuable. They do not all describe the same weather, they describe regional consequences of a wider disruption. In one place, summer frost, in another, drought, somewhere else, heavy rain, failed grain, or sudden hunger. A major disturbance in the atmosphere would not create one identical forecast across half the planet. It would interfere with the systems that normally guide weather: monsoons, storm tracks, growing seasons, temperatures, and rainfall. The result would be chaos, not uniformity. Farther west in the Middle East, chroniclers also remembered a sun that had changed. The Syriac-speaking world stretched across regions that now include parts of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. It was a world of monasteries, trading towns, farming villages, and old cities sitting between great empires. Its writers did not always use Roman dates. Some counted years from the reigns of kings. Others used the Seleucid era, a calendar beginning centuries before Christ. Still others were copied by later scribes whose own dating methods had changed, so historians have to do detective work. They compare reigns, wars, eclipses, church councils, harvests, and references to rulers. They ask whether two events that appear under different years may actually describe the same season. It is slow work, sometimes frustrating work. But when the dates are aligned as carefully as possible, the same period keeps appearing, the middle of the 530s. In these Middle Eastern accounts, darkness and failed ripening stand out. The sun is weak. Fruit does not mature properly. The agricultural year loses its normal rhythm. And that detail matters because the Middle East was not Ireland. It was not northern China. These regions had different crops, different rainfall patterns, different political systems, and different writers. Yet they were all vulnerable to a sky that no longer delivered dependable warmth. There are hints from other places as well, in parts of northern Europe. Later chronicles remember harsh seasons and food shortages. In Korea and Japan, records from the broader East Asian world preserve reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena and difficult weather in the same general era. Some scholars see these as supporting evidence for a hemisphere-wide event. Others urge caution, pointing out that ancient records are incomplete and that unusual weather was never rare. That caution is necessary. Medieval chroniclers did not write with modern climate science in mind. They often connected storms, famine, and celestial signs with the sins of rulers or the moral condition of society. A famine might be recorded because it was politically important, religiously meaningful, or personally devastating, while a similar famine somewhere else went unmentioned. Surviving documents are accidents of preservation. A monastery burns and a century of local weather memory disappears. A court archive survives and one region suddenly looks far better documented than another. Silence does not mean clear skies. And one dramatic report does not automatically mean catastrophe everywhere. But we do not need every chronicle to be perfect. We do not need every region to have suffered in exactly the same way. What matters is the convergence across distant parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Sources point toward an interval of dim light, abnormal cold, damaged harvests, and hunger. The language changes, the calendars change, the certainty changes, but the outline remains. The sun seemed weaker. Summer sometimes felt like winter. Crops failed to ripen, and communities that had survived ordinary bad weather found themselves facing something that did not feel ordinary at all. A strange sky had spread beyond the Mediterranean, and now historians had to ask the next question. What could put a veil over so much of the world? One answer rose above the others, slowly at first, then with more and more evidence behind it. A volcano. Not the kind of eruption people usually picture. Not simply a mountain exploding, lava pouring down its slopes, and villages buried under black ash. Those disasters are terrifying, but they are mostly local. Ash is heavy, even when an eruption is enormous. Much of the thick grey material falls back to earth relatively close to the volcano. It can bury farms, collapse roofs, poison water, and turn day into night for people living nearby. But ash alone does not usually explain why observers thousands of miles apart describe years of weak sunlight and failing summers. For that, you need something that can climb much higher. You need sulfur. Deep beneath a volcano, molten rock contains dissolved gases under immense pressure. Water vapour, carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds are trapped in the magma, squeezed like gas inside a sealed bottle. As magma rises toward the surface, the pressure drops. The gases expand, bubbles form, and if enough gas is released quickly enough, the result can be explosive. The mountain does not just crack open, it detonates. In the most powerful eruptions, the blast punches a column of gas, ash, and shattered rock high into the atmosphere, sometimes astonishingly high. Higher than ordinary clouds, higher than the weather systems that bring rain over one region and sunshine over another. The eruption plume can reach the stratosphere, a layer of the atmosphere beginning roughly 6 to 12 miles above the ground, depending on where you are on Earth. And once material reaches the stratosphere, the rules change. Down near the surface, in the lower atmosphere, weather is constantly cleaning the sky. Rain washes particles out, winds move them around, clouds form and disappear. A layer of dust or smoke may linger for days or weeks, perhaps longer in some conditions, but eventually it is pulled down by gravity and precipitation. The stratosphere is different. It is drier, more stable. There is very little rain up there to scrub the air clean. So if an explosive eruption injects sulfur gases into that high, quiet layer of the atmosphere, they can remain there for a year or even several years. The important gas is sulfur dioxide. Once it reaches the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapour and other chemicals in the air. It forms tiny droplets called sulfate aerosols. The word aerosol sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Imagine billions upon billions of microscopic particles suspended in the sky. They are far too small to see individually, but together, spread around the planet, they can form a thin veil between the sun and the surface of the Earth. Not a dark curtain, something more deceptive than that. A pale, milky haze, a high atmospheric filter, enough to scatter and reflect a fraction of incoming sunlight back into space before it can warm the ground below. And that small fraction can matter enormously. Earth's climate is a balance of incoming energy and outgoing energy. The sun warms the land, oceans and air. The planet releases heat back towards space. Change the balance just a little, especially during the growing season, and the consequences can move through entire food systems. Aerosols do not need to block the sun completely. They only need to reduce the warmth reaching the surface at the wrong moment. Picture a farmer in the 6th century. He does not know anything about sulfur dioxide. He has never heard the word stratosphere, but he understands sunlight. He understands that seeds need warmth. He understands that grain needs a certain number of good days to ripen before autumn arrives. He understands that one hard frost can destroy a season's work. Now imagine the sky above his fields growing faint and hazy. The days are still technically daytime. You can still see the sun. But it has lost its force. The air remains colder than it should be. Snow falls late. Frost arrives early. Rain patterns shift. A summer that normally provides enough warmth for grain to mature becomes too short, too cold, too uncertain. The crop may not die all at once. That is what makes this kind of disaster so dangerous. Some plants grow poorly, some fail to flower. Some flower but do not produce full grain. Fruit ripens late or not at all. In higher latitudes, where farmers are already working close to the edge of what the season allows, even a modest drop in summer temperature can be devastating. A field that succeeds in an ordinary year can fail in a cold one. And the effects do not stop with temperature. When the planet cools suddenly, weather patterns can reorganize. Storm tracks may shift. Monsoons can weaken or change direction. Some regions may become wetter. Others may experience drought. A volcanic veil does not create one simple global weather report. It disrupts the machinery that normally distributes heat and moisture around the world. That helps explain why historical accounts from the mid-6th century do not all sound identical. Ireland remembered failed bread. Parts of China recorded cold, frost, hunger, and abnormal weather. Mediterranean writers described a sun that seemed strangely dim. Other regions may have faced too much rain, too little rain, or seasons that arrived at the wrong time. The details changed from place to place because climate is local. But the disturbance above the climate system could have been global or at least hemisphere-wide. This is what scientists mean when they talk about a volcanic winter. It does not mean the whole Earth instantly freezes beneath snow. It does not mean every day is dark. It means a major eruption sends enough sunlight-reflecting material into the upper atmosphere that average temperatures fall, especially across the hemisphere where the aerosols are concentrated. The cooling can last through one growing season, then another. And for societies dependent on local harvests, that may be all it takes. One bad harvest hurts. 2 bad harvests change everything. By the time people begin eating seed grain, slaughtering breeding animals, abandoning farms or moving in search of food, the original atmospheric event has become something much larger. A cloud high above the earth becomes famine at ground level. Famine becomes debt, migration, conflict, disease, and political instability. The volcano may be far away, on an island no farmer has ever heard of, but its effects can arrive in every empty granary. This idea was not accepted overnight. At first, historians had the written sources, reports of strange light, cold weather, and failed crops. Then, climate scientists began looking for evidence in the natural world. If a huge eruption really had taken place around 536, it should have left traces. Not necessarily a neat label saying, "The volcano was here." Nature rarely gives us anything that convenient. But it might have left sulfur in places where time is stored layer by layer. Still, there was a problem. Volcanoes erupt often. Most are too small to affect global climate. Some large eruptions leave signals that are difficult to date precisely. And even when scientists find evidence for a major eruption, identifying the exact volcano can be remarkably difficult. The eruption may have occurred in a remote region. Its crater may be hidden beneath ice, forest, ocean, or younger volcanic deposits. The ash may have fallen where no one preserved a written record. Or more than one volcano may have erupted within a few years, their effects combining into a crisis that no single mountain created alone. So the question was no longer just, did a volcano erupt? It became more complicated. How large was the eruption? When exactly did it happen? Which hemisphere did it affect most? Was 536 caused by one colossal blast, or by a sequence of eruptions that kept the sky veiled for years? To answer those questions, scientists had to travel to the coldest archives on Earth. They had to look inside the ice. At first glance, an ice sheet looks empty. A vast white desert, wind, snow, cold so deep that even time seems to slow down. But Greenland and Antarctica are not empty at all. They are libraries. Every year, snow falls onto their high-frozen interiors. More snow follows the next year and the year after that. The old layers are buried under new ones. Their loose crystals compress. The weight of centuries squeezes them into dense ice, and trapped inside that ice are tiny samples of the ancient atmosphere. Little bubbles of air, particles of dust, sea salt carried inland by storms, smoke from distant wildfires, and, when a volcano erupts with enough force to reach the stratosphere, sulfur. This is the incredible part. A volcanic eruption can happen on the other side of the world, sending sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere. The gas transforms into sulfate aerosols. Those aerosols spread through the sky, then slowly settle back toward Earth. Some are carried by snowstorms over Greenland. Others drift south and fall over Antarctica. Each snowfall captures a little of that atmospheric debris. Then it is sealed away, preserved in ice for more than 1,000 years. So scientists do something that sounds almost impossible. They drill down through the ice, not just a few feet, sometimes miles. They pull out long cylindrical columns called ice cores, each one a frozen timeline. The newest snow is near the top. Deeper down, the ice becomes older. A layer from the 20th century sits above a layer from the Middle Ages. Below that are layers from the Roman world, the ancient Near East and beyond. Far below those are layers formed before cities, before farming, before human history as we normally understand it. And somewhere inside those frozen columns is the 6th century. The year's around 536. Scientists cut the core into sections, melt tiny samples, and measure what the water contains. They look for chemicals that should not be there in ordinary amounts. One of the most important is sulfate. A little sulfate can come from sea spray, dust, or other natural processes. But a sudden sharp spike is different. It is like finding a thick black line in the middle of a long pale record. Something happened. The atmosphere changed, and enough sulfur fell over the ice sheet to be preserved for 14 centuries. For years, the 6th century gave researchers exactly that kind of signal. In Greenland ice cores, scientists found a major sulfate deposit dated to around 536 AD. It was not a faint smudge, it was a pronounced volcanic marker, evidence that the atmosphere had received a substantial injection of sulfur. The timing was hard to ignore. Written accounts from the Mediterranean, Europe and Asia were describing strange sunlight, cold seasons, failed harvests, and hunger. Tree rings, as we will see, would later point toward unusually severe summer cooling. Different kinds of evidence from different places, all beginning to point toward the same dark patch in history. The old stories were not necessarily exaggerations. The dim sun may have had a physical cause. Now, sulfate in ice does not tell us exactly what the weather was like in every village. It cannot tell us whether one farmer lost his wheat to frost, whether another watched rain ruin his fields, or whether a family in Ireland had enough grain left for winter. But it can tell us that the sky itself had been altered by a major volcanic event. And it tells us something else. 536 may not have been a single isolated blow. Deeper in the investigation, scientists found another important sulfate signal around 540 AD. 4 years later, that second spike matters because volcanic cooling is already dangerous after one major eruption. A single eruption can shorten growing seasons, weaken harvests, and strain food supplies. But a second major eruption arriving before societies have recovered is something else entirely. Think about it. A community survives the first cold years by using stored grain. It sells possessions. It eats seed stock meant for planting. It borrows from neighbours. It slaughters animals it cannot afford to feed. It reduces meals. It hopes that next summer will be normal. Then the sky darkens again. The temperatures fall again. The harvest fails again. This is how an environmental shock becomes a long crisis. Not necessarily because every year is equally cold everywhere, but because people have less and less room to absorb another bad season. Reserves disappear, debts accumulate, malnutrition weakens immune systems. Local shortages become regional price shocks. Regional shortages become migrations, unrest, and vulnerability to disease. The sulfate record suggests that the mid-6th century may have been hit by a sequence of eruptions, not merely one terrible event in 536. The first eruption may have started the crisis. The later event around 540 may have extended it, deepened it, or pushed already weakened societies into even greater danger. And this is where the story becomes more precise, but also more complicated. Dating ice is not as simple as counting obvious yearly lines all the way down. Near the surface, annual layers can be relatively clear. Winter snow and summer snow may differ in dust, chemistry, and texture. But as the ice gets older and deeper, the layers become compressed. They thin. They bend around buried landscapes. They can be disturbed by flowing ice. 1,000 years of snow may be easy to separate near the top of a core, but much harder to distinguish far below. So early ice core chronologies sometimes placed volcanic signals within a range of years, rather than on one exact date. That matters enormously when historians are comparing a chemical spike with a written report from 536, or a cold summer recorded in 537, or a famine mentioned several years later. Over time, scientists improved the timeline. They compared multiple ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. They measured seasonal variations in chemicals. They matched known volcanic eruptions from more recent centuries, eruptions with written observations and well-established dates. They used markers from nuclear testing in the modern era, cosmic events, and other precisely dated signals to check the clocks preserved in the ice. The result was not one perfect, unquestionable calendar. Nature almost never gives us that, but the chronologies became much better. The major sulfate event could be placed very close to 536, and the later signal close to 540. Those dates lined up with the historical and biological evidence strongly enough that the volcanic explanation moved from an interesting possibility to the leading framework for understanding the crisis. Still, there is one thing the ice refuses to reveal easily: the name of the volcano. A sulfate spike tells scientists that sulfur reached the atmosphere and later fell onto an ice sheet. The size of the signal can help estimate how large the atmospheric disturbance may have been. Comparing Greenland with Antarctica, can offer clues about whether the eruption was more concentrated in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, or spread widely across both. But sulfate is not a fingerprint in the usual sense. It does not arrive with a label attached. It does not say, "This sulfur came from Iceland," or Alaska, or Central America, or a tropical volcano hidden beneath a lake, jungle, or later eruption. For that, scientists need something rarer. They need ash. Not the thick ash that buries a town near an eruption. Tiny fragments can travel astonishing distances. Microscopic shards of volcanic glass, sometimes smaller than a grain of sand, can settle into ice along with sulfate. These fragments are called tephra, and their chemistry can sometimes be matched to a known volcanic source, like matching a shard of broken glass to the bottle it came from. But there is a problem. Not every eruption sends identifiable ash to Greenland or Antarctica. Not every ice core preserves enough fragments to analyze. And not every potential volcano has been sampled well enough for comparison. A large sulfate signal may survive while the crucial ash fingerprint remains missing. So the ice tells us something powerful, but not everything. It tells us that the 6th century sky was likely loaded with volcanic sulfur. It tells us the disturbance began around 536. It tells us another major injection followed around 540. It tells us this was not merely a strange story repeated by frightened chroniclers. The atmosphere itself left a record, but the frozen archive also leaves us with a mystery. If the ice can show us the damage, can it help identify the culprit? And if multiple eruptions were involved, can scientists separate one disaster from the next? That is where the newest evidence begins to matter. The newest evidence comes from looking at the ice in much finer detail. For a long time, scientists were mainly searching for chemical spikes. A sudden rise in sulfate told them that something volcanic had happened. It was powerful evidence, but it was also broad evidence. Sulfate can travel around the planet. It can remain in the stratosphere for months, sometimes years. By the time it falls as snow over Greenland, it may be thousands of miles from the eruption that created it. To solve the mystery, researchers needed to find something more specific. Something like a fingerprint. That fingerprint is called cryptotephra. Tephra is volcanic ash. Usually when we picture ash from an eruption, we imagine a grey cloud rising above a mountain or thick deposits covering roads, roofs, fields and forests. But volcanic ash can also travel in fragments so small they are almost invisible. Tiny shards of volcanic glass, thinner than a human hair, can be carried high into the atmosphere and scattered across continents. When those microscopic shards settle into snow and become trapped in ice, they are called cryptotephra. Hidden ash. A single shard may look like almost nothing. A clear or brownish speck easily missed among dust and mineral grains. But under a microscope it becomes a clue, and when scientists analyze its chemistry, it can become an astonishingly precise clue. Every volcano has its own magma system. Different amounts of silica, iron, calcium, sodium, potassium and other elements are mixed into its molten rock. When that magma erupts and cools into glass, it preserves a chemical signature, not perfectly unique in every case, but often distinctive enough to compare with ash deposits found near known volcanoes. It is a little like comparing handwriting. One letter may not prove much, but a whole pattern of loops, angles, spacing and pressure can point strongly toward one writer rather than another. Scientists now use extremely sensitive instruments to read those patterns in microscopic ash shards. They can measure the major elements in volcanic glass. In some cases they can look at trace elements too, the rarer chemical ingredients that make the fingerprint sharper. Then they compare the ice core shards with samples from volcanic deposits around the world. This work is slow. Imagine searching through ancient ice meltwater for a handful of particles smaller than a grain of dust. Then imagine that those particles have been buried for nearly 1,500 years. Some may be broken, some may be contaminated by ordinary dust. Some layers contain no useful shards at all, but when the particles are there, they can do what sulfate alone cannot. They can begin to tell scientists where the eruption happened. And in the layers close to 536, researchers have found evidence that strengthens the volcanic case in a major way. High-resolution analysis of Greenland ice cores has revealed not only a sharp sulfate signal, but volcanic glass particles associated with the same period. Their chemistry appears consistent with an eruption in the North Atlantic volcanic zone, with Iceland emerging as one of the strongest candidate regions. That does not mean the case is closed. Iceland is a land built by volcanoes. It has many volcanic systems, some buried beneath glaciers, some altered by later eruptions, some difficult to sample directly. Matching a shard in Greenland ice to one exact crater is much harder than matching it to a broad region. The chemical evidence may point toward Icelandic volcanism without naming a single mountain beyond doubt. Still, that regional connection matters. An eruption in Iceland would make sense of several parts of the puzzle. Greenland lies relatively close. Ash and sulfur could have entered northern hemisphere air currents quickly. A large high-latitude eruption may have produced a powerful regional atmospheric disturbance, dimming sunlight and disrupting summer weather across Europe and parts of Asia. But that may only explain the first blow. The later volcanic signal, around 540, appears to tell a different story. In some ice core records, the 540 event is visible not only in Greenland but in Antarctica as well. That wider distribution suggests that at least some of its sulfur may have reached both hemispheres, and that raises the possibility of an eruption closer to the tropics, where material injected high into the atmosphere can spread north and south more efficiently. Several source regions have been proposed. Some researchers have looked towards Central America, including the great eruption of Ilopango in what is now El Salvador. Others have considered volcanoes in Indonesia, the wider Pacific, Alaska, or other poorly documented volcanic regions. There are also eruptions whose deposits may have been buried, eroded, or hidden beneath water, forests, ice, and later lava flows. The planet has no shortage of volcanoes capable of leaving a mark. The problem is proving which one did, and the dating is getting better. This is one of the most important changes in the whole investigation. Newer ice core projects do not just take samples every few years or every few centimeters. In favorable sections of the core, scientists can examine the chemistry at much higher resolution, sometimes close enough to track seasonal changes. They compare sulfate, dust, sea salt, and other chemicals across multiple cores. They identify annual layers where possible. They test their timelines against known events with secure dates. The result is a more tightly aligned sequence. A major volcanic disturbance appears very close to the beginning of the climate shock in 536. Another substantial disturbance follows around 540. And the cold crop failures and social strain recorded across the 6th century fall into the same broad window. That does not prove that every famine, every conflict, and every outbreak of disease was caused by volcanoes. History is never that simple. Societies had their own political struggles, inequalities, wars, and vulnerabilities long before the skies changed. But it does make one interpretation much harder to dismiss. The darkened sun was probably not one strange weather event. It was likely the opening phase of a volcanic sequence. One eruption may have loaded the northern hemisphere sky with sulfur around 536. Another, perhaps larger or more globally distributed, seems to have struck around 540. There may even have been additional disturbances in the years between and after them. Not one single catastrophe, but repeated atmospheric shocks arriving while communities were still trying to recover from the last one. And that is what makes the evidence so unsettling. The question is no longer simply, what happened in 536? It is becoming, how many times did the sky turn against them? The ice tells us that the atmosphere was disturbed, but trees tell us what that disturbance did to the living world below. A tree cannot write a diary. It cannot tell us that the summer felt cold, that the rains came at the wrong time, or that the sunlight had a strange, weak quality. But every year it adds a new layer of wood beneath its bark. And in that wood it leaves a record of how difficult that year was. A good growing season produces a healthy ring. The tree has enough warmth, enough moisture, enough sunlight, enough time to build new cells. The ring grows wider. In some species, especially trees growing near the northern edge of where forests can survive, the wood also becomes denser at the end of summer. The tree is taking advantage of every possible day before winter returns. But when summer is cold, short, cloudy, or otherwise stressful, growth slows. The ring becomes narrow, the late wood becomes less dense. Sometimes the tree barely grows at all. This is the basic idea behind dendrochronology, the science of tree rings. And it is one of the most powerful tools historians have for reconstructing climate before thermometers, weather stations, and satellite records. Because unlike a written chronicle, a tree ring can often be assigned to a specific year. Not approximately, not somewhere in a broad century. A specific year. Scientists do this by matching patterns. One tree may have a sequence of wide rings, then several narrow ones, then a wider recovery ring. Another tree from the same region may show the same sequence. When researchers compare hundreds, sometimes thousands, of living trees, archaeological timbers, old buildings, buried logs, and preserved wood from lakes or peat bogs, they can build a continuous timeline stretching back centuries or even millennia. It is like lining up overlapping pieces of a very old barcode, and when the barcode reaches the year 536, something alarming appears. Across parts of Europe, Asia, and North America, trees show evidence of sharply reduced growth. Not everywhere equally. Climate is local. A cold summer in Scandinavia does not look exactly like a cold summer in the Alps, Siberia, Mongolia, or the mountains of western North America. Rainfall matters too. Soil matters. The age of the tree matters. In some places, drought can make a ring narrow, even if temperatures are normal. That is why scientists do not rely on one tree, or one forest, or one type of measurement. They compare networks. They look for the same stress signal appearing across huge distances. And beginning in 536, the signal is hard to ignore. Tree ring records from high northern latitudes and mountain regions show a sudden deterioration in growing conditions. Summers became colder, in some areas dramatically colder. The trees were not witnessing a single bad afternoon. They were recording a season that failed to behave like summer. This is especially clear in trees growing near the limits of survival. At high elevations and high latitudes, trees live close to a temperature threshold. Give them a reasonably warm summer and they grow. Take away a few degrees, shorten the season. Cover the sky with a haze that weakens sunlight, and their growth can collapse. They are like biological thermometers, except they have been standing in the landscape for hundreds of years. Some of the most detailed reconstructions suggest that 536 was among the coldest summers of the last 2 millennia in large parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In Central Europe, the summer may have been far below the long-term average. In parts of Scandinavia and the Alps, the drop appears severe. Northern Asia shows stress as well, so does North America. And then comes the detail that makes this story worse. The cold did not simply arrive in 536 and disappear the next year. Tree ring evidence suggests that the following decade contained a cluster of unusually cold summers. Conditions may have eased in some places, then worsened again. One failed growing season is frightening. 2 in a row can empty granaries. Several spread across a decade can change the entire structure of a society. Think about what a farming community needed from summer. It needed enough warmth for grain to ripen, enough dry weather to bring in the harvest, enough sun for plants to produce the energy stored in seeds, enough time between spring planting and autumn frost. A small change could reduce yields, a major change could leave fields full of crops that never matured. And people living in the 6th century had almost no margin for that kind of failure. There were no refrigerated warehouses, no global grain market capable of instantly moving food from a continent untouched by bad weather. No modern fertilizer, crop insurance, or emergency aid system. Some states, including the Eastern Roman Empire, had grain stores and trade networks. Some communities could rely on livestock, fishing, hunting, or local exchange. But even the strongest systems were vulnerable when weather shocks covered enormous areas at once. The trees cannot tell us exactly how many people went hungry. That part matters. A narrow ring does not equal a famine. It does not prove that a village was abandoned, that a child died, or that a government collapsed. Trees record biological stress, not human suffering directly. They do not know whether a community had stored food, wealthy patrons, access to trade, or a ruler willing to lower taxes during a crisis. And people are adaptable. They substitute foods. They migrate. They borrow. They slaughter animals they might otherwise have kept. They gather wild plants. They make impossible choices that leave little trace in wood or ice. But tree rings can show when the environmental pressure was real. They can show that the strange reports of dim sunlight were not merely poetic exaggeration. When writers in the Mediterranean described a sun that gave little heat, and records from elsewhere spoke of failed crops or unseasonable cold, the forests were registering the same broad crisis in their own silent way. A historian writes, "The harvest was poor." A tree answers, "Yes." Summer was weak, and when that answer comes from forests separated by oceans, mountains, languages, and political borders, it becomes much harder to dismiss. The sky had darkened, the ice had captured the volcanic fallout, and now the trees were showing the consequence on the ground. For farmers, the catastrophe was no longer floating somewhere high above the clouds. It was standing in the field, green but stunted, waiting for a summer that never truly arrived. For a farmer, summer was not a pleasant break between spring and autumn. It was the narrow window in which the entire year was decided. A field of wheat needed warmth to rise, flower, and fill its grain. Barley needed enough time to ripen before the first cold nights returned. Grapes needed sun. Olive trees needed predictable seasons. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored before rain spoiled it. Sheep and cattle needed pasture through the warm months, because the grass gathered in summer would become the fodder that kept them alive through winter. Everything depended on timing. Plant too early, and a late frost could kill the tender shoots. Plant too late, and the crop might still be green when autumn arrived. Too much rain during harvest could flatten grain into the mud, rot fruit on the branch, and turn cut hay into useless blackened clumps. Too little rain could be just as dangerous, and if the summer itself was cold, cloudy, and short, the plants might grow but never finish the job. They might stand in the fields looking almost healthy, green alive, and almost worthless. This is one of the cruelest things about a failed harvest. It does not always look like a battlefield or a burned village. Sometimes it looks like grain that never ripens, apples that remain small and sour, vines that produce little fruit. wet hay that cannot be stored. A crop that gave people hope all spring and summer, then betrayed them at the last possible moment. The cold described in tree rings would have been especially dangerous because it could strike at every stage of the agricultural calendar. A frost in late spring could kill seedlings just after they emerged. Cold weather during early summer could slow growth when plants needed to build leaves and stems. Weak sunlight could reduce the energy available for grain production. Then an early frost in late summer or autumn could end the growing season before the harvest was ready. A farmer could do everything right. Plough the field, save seed from the previous year, plant at the customary time, pray for rain when rain was needed, and dry weather when the grain began to turn gold, and still lose. That is what made abnormal summers so frightening. They broke the relationship between knowledge and survival. Farming communities had generations of experience. They knew which fields held moisture. They knew when to sow. They knew how to read clouds, winds, insects, birds, and the first changes in the leaves. But their knowledge was built around a world with recognizable seasons. When summer stopped acting like summer, experience became less useful, and not every region faced the same danger. In the Mediterranean, communities had advantages that northern farmers did not. The growing season was generally longer. Olive oil, wine, legumes, fish, and trade offered alternatives to a single grain harvest. In some coastal areas, ships could bring food from elsewhere. The great cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, especially Constantinople, were tied into systems designed to move grain across the sea. But Mediterranean agriculture also depended on delicate rhythms. Olives could be damaged by unusual cold. Vineyards were vulnerable to late frosts and wet weather. Grain harvests depended on rain arriving in the right season, then stopping at the right time. A strange sky that weakened warmth might not turn Italy, Greece, or Syria into frozen wasteland, but it could still reduce yields across a region already supporting dense populations, armies, tax collectors, merchants, monasteries, and cities. And if several neighbouring provinces suffered at once, trade became less of a solution. Because trade does not create food, it only moves food from one place to another. In northern Europe, the margin was thinner. The season was already short. Crops such as barley and oats could tolerate cooler conditions better than Mediterranean wheat, but they still needed enough warmth and enough frost-free days to mature. A few degrees of cooling could matter enormously near the northern edge of cultivation. In highland valleys and mountain communities, the risk may have been greater still. At altitude, summer arrives late and leaves early, even in a good year. Fields can be productive, but only if the growing season holds. A late frost, a cold, wet June, or an early August chill could compress the agricultural year into almost nothing. The same was true in parts of Scandinavia, the Alps, the Balkans, Central Asia, and other landscapes where people farmed close to climate limits. These communities often had practical strategies. They kept livestock. They gathered wild foods. They fished, hunted, traded, and preserved what they could. They did not simply wait helplessly for wheat to grow, but livestock needed fodder, and fodder came from summer. If the grass grew poorly or rain ruined the hay crop, animals entered winter weak. Then people faced a terrible calculation: keep the animals and risk watching them starve, or slaughter them early, gaining meat for a short time, but losing milk, wool, manure, traction, breeding stock, and future security. A bad grain harvest was one problem. A bad grain harvest combined with failing pasture was a much deeper crisis. And this is where one bad year could become many. Most farming households saved grain not only for eating, but for seed. In a normal year, Part of the harvest went into the granary, part went into taxes or rent, part fed the family, and part was guarded for spring planting. When the harvest failed, those categories collapsed into one desperate pile. People ate the seed grain. They had to. But when spring returned, there was less to plant. Even if the weather improved, recovery could be slow. Families might have sold tools, animals, or land to survive. They might owe debts to wealthier neighbours. They might have lost workers to hunger, disease, migration, or military service. A household that had been poor but stable could become permanently dependent after a single disastrous harvest. Then imagine a second poor summer, or a third. The granary was no longer a reserve. It was empty. For peasants, this meant hunger before the next harvest, rising debt, and the possibility of abandoning land that could no longer support them. For landlords, it meant rents that could not be paid, labourers who disappeared, estates producing less grain, less wine, less oil, and less revenue. For towns, it meant food arriving in smaller quantities just as more desperate people came looking for relief. Prices rose. Those with stored grain could wait. Those without it could not. A merchant with full warehouses might make enormous profits. A landowner with surplus could lend at harsh terms. But a city crowd, living day to day, had little protection when bread became expensive. Neither did the rural poor, whose payments to landlords or officials were often demanded in grain, labour, or coin, regardless of whether the weather had cooperated. States could intervene, at least in theory. Imperial governments maintained grain supplies, regulated markets, collected taxes, and sometimes organised relief. Constantinople had long depended on grain brought by sea. Other cities had local storehouses, charitable institutions, wealthy patrons, churches, and civic officials who could distribute food in an emergency. But state systems were strongest when the crisis was local. A flood in one province could be answered with grain from another. A failed harvest in one valley could be softened by trade from a neighbouring region. But the evidence from 536 suggests a disturbance spread across vast parts of the northern hemisphere. When cold reaches across borders, every granary becomes more important. Every shipload matters. Every failed field becomes part of a larger equation. And somewhere, in a village with damp grain hanging uselessly in the stalks, people would have understood the problem before any official announcement arrived. They would have looked at the sky, they would have felt the cold, and they would have realized that winter was coming, with far too little to meet it. And this is the part of the story that is hardest to see. Not because it was small, because hunger is quiet. Wars leave dramatic traces. A city is burned. A king is defeated. An army marches across a border. Chroniclers record the names of generals, the date of a battle, the number of prisoners, sometimes even the exact shape of a battlefield centuries after the blood has dried. But famine often enters the record indirectly. A complaint about the price of grain. A tax payment that never arrives. A village abandoned. A donation to a monastery, a law against hoarding, a merchant ship redirected toward a hungry city, a brief line written by someone far from the suffering itself, noting that there had been a shortage, that the harvest was poor, that people endured unusual hardship, then silence. The people who died first were rarely the people writing history. They were tenant farmers with no stored grain, labourers paid day by day. Widows, orphans, enslaved people, migrants, families living in marginal land, where even a normal harvest was only just enough. They did not leave memoirs explaining how the bread became smaller, how the animals grew thin, or how they decided which child would receive the last bowl of porridge. So historians have to be careful. We cannot point to one document and say with complete certainty that every region affected by the strange sky of 536 suffered the same famine at the same moment. The evidence is uneven. Some places are better documented than others. Some harvests may have survived. Some communities had access to fish, trade, stored food, wealthy patrons, or local landscapes that softened the blow. But we can make a reasonable inference. If tree rings show severe cooling across large areas, if written sources describe a dimmed sun and unseasonable cold, and if agriculture depended on warmth, timing, and a short growing season, then food production was under extraordinary pressure. And when food production falls, hunger follows, not always immediately. That is another cruel thing about famine. The disaster may begin in the summer, but the worst suffering can arrive months later. At first, people use their reserves. They stretch flour with beans, roots, weeds, and anything edible they can find. They slaughter animals they would normally keep alive. They borrow grain from neighbours. They sell household goods. Tools, clothing, land. They take on debts that will follow them long after the weather has changed. Then the reserves disappear, and the price of food begins to move. Imagine a market town after a weak harvest. Grain carts arrive less often. The sacks are smaller. Farmers who have anything left are reluctant to sell because they are thinking about winter, seed grain, taxes, rent, and their own children. Merchants understand what scarcity means. Some may release grain slowly, waiting for prices to rise further. Others may simply be unable to obtain supplies because the countryside has little surplus to offer. The market still exists, coins still change hands. But the same coins buy less bread every week. For the wealthy, rising prices were painful, inconvenient, perhaps politically dangerous. For the poor, they could be fatal. A landowner with stores of wheat might survive a bad year comfortably. A monastery with fields, donations, and granaries might feed its own community and perhaps offer alms to others. An imperial official in a major city might have access to subsidized grain or state distribution networks. A merchant with ships could seek supplies from more fortunate ports. But a labourer whose wages stayed the same while bread doubled in price had no such cushion. Neither did the small farmer who had already eaten the grain meant for planting. And hunger does not only mean an empty stomach, it means malnutrition. It means children growing weaker because the food in the household has less protein, less fat, less everything. It means mothers producing less milk. It means older people failing first. It means wounds healing slowly. It means bodies losing the strength to work precisely when survival demands more work than ever. A hungry population is also a vulnerable population. Immunity weakens when diets collapse. Illnesses that might normally be survived become more dangerous. A simple infection, a bout of diarrhea, a fever carried through a crowded household can become lethal when the body has been living on too little food for too long. This does not mean that the climatic shock of 536 directly caused every disease outbreak that followed. History is rarely that simple, but hunger can prepare the ground. It can turn a difficult winter into a mass death event. It can make communities less able to care for the sick. It can push desperate people into towns where food might be available but crowding and disease were greater risks. It can force migration along roads, coasts, and river routes, carrying hardship from one place to another, and animals suffered too. A poor hay harvest meant less winter fodder. Cold, wet conditions could damage pasture. Livestock weakened by hunger were more likely to die from exposure or disease. Farmers might slaughter breeding animals early, gaining a few meals in the present while sacrificing milk, manure, wool, traction, and future herds. That loss mattered far beyond meat. Oxen pulled ploughs, horses carried goods, sheep provided wool, cattle produced milk, hides, and manure that helped maintain the fertility of fields. When livestock numbers fell, the effects could stretch into the next planting season and the season after that. A failed harvest could become a failed recovery. Food shortages also changed trade in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to imagine. Grain normally moved because merchants could profit from regional differences. One province had a surplus, another needed supplies. Ships and wagons connected the two. But when cold or bad weather affected broad areas at once, the map of trade changed. Exporting regions held on to grain. Governments may have tried to secure supplies for armies and capitals. Local elites may have protected their own stores. Prices rose not only because food was scarce, but because everyone feared it would become scarcer still. That fear matters. Markets run on expectations as much as sacks of wheat. If people believe the next harvest may fail too, they do not sell freely. They store, they speculate, they panic. A rumour of empty granaries in one town can raise prices in another before the shortage has physically arrived. And in a world without modern refrigeration, instant communication, or emergency food programs on a continental scale, delays could kill. For ordinary people, there was no reliable safety net. There was family, if family had food. There was charity, if charity had resources. There was the church, the landlord, the local official, the village granary, perhaps a distant market reachable after days of travel, and sometimes there was nothing. If you enjoy these quiet, unsettling corners of history, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. Because famine is easy to reduce to a number, a percentage lost, a price increase, a line in a chronicle. But for those living through it, famine was not an abstract crisis. It was the sound of a granary that no longer had anything in it. It was the decision to sell the last animal. It was watching food become too expensive to buy. It was realizing that the fields had failed and winter had not. And in Justinian's empire, with its crowded cities, ambitious armies, complicated tax systems, and dependence on long-distance grain, that quiet disaster was about to collide with power on a much larger scale. At the centre of this crisis stood one of the most ambitious rulers of the ancient world, Emperor Justinian. In 536, Justinian had ruled the Eastern Roman Empire for less than a decade. But he was already attempting something enormous. From his capital at Constantinople, he dreamed of restoring the old Roman world, not merely preserving what remained of the empire in the eastern Mediterranean, but reclaiming the western provinces that had been lost to Germanic kingdoms generations earlier. Italy, North Africa, parts of Spain, the old imperial map or something close to it. And for a while the dream seemed possible. Justinian's armies had already defeated the Vandal kingdom in North Africa with astonishing speed. In 533 and 534, the general Belisarius crossed the Mediterranean, won a series of victories, and returned the wealthy African provinces to imperial control. It was the kind of success emperors liked to imagine would happen. Quick, glorious, profitable. Then came Italy. In 535, Justinian launched a war against the Ostrogoths, the rulers of Italy. Again, Belisarius led the campaign. Sicily fell, then Naples. Then Rome itself, the ancient capital of the empire, opened its gates to the Eastern Roman army. For Justinian it must have looked like history was moving in his direction. But empires are expensive things. Armies do not live on glory. They live on grain, animals, weapons, pay, roads, ships, fodder, and a constant flow of supplies from people who may be hundreds of miles away from the battlefield. Every soldier marching through Italy represented farmers producing food somewhere else. Every horse required feed. Every garrison occupying a city required grain to arrive. Month after month, even when roads were unsafe and coastlines were contested. And all of this depended on administration. The Byzantine Empire was not a simple machine. It was a vast collection of provinces, officials, tax collectors, landowners, merchants, bishops, soldiers, sailors, and local communities. Orders moved outward from Constantinople. Taxes and goods were supposed to move back toward the state. Grain could be requisitioned, ships could be hired. Local officials could be ordered to find supplies, but every link in that chain depended on people having something left to give. Now imagine what happens when the sun dims, when summers grow cold, when harvests become uncertain. Justinian's government did not suddenly stop functioning in 536. The empire remained powerful, its armies still fought, its tax collectors still collected, its capital was still one of the greatest cities on earth, crowded with merchants, officials, artisans, clergy and people drawn from across the Mediterranean world. But a state already committed to major wars had less room for error. A poor harvest in one region might normally be balanced by grain from another. A city facing a shortage might draw on stored supplies. An army could requisition food from the countryside. A government could demand additional taxes or emergency deliveries. But if bad weather affected wide areas at once, those solutions became harder. The countryside had less surplus. Merchants had fewer cheap cargoes to move. Provincial taxpayers had less income. And the same grain that might have fed an army could also be needed by a hungry town. This is where environmental disaster becomes political. Not because cold weather decides who wins every battle. It does not. Wars are shaped by commanders, logistics, morale, diplomacy, money, fortifications, disease, luck, and thousands of individual choices. The Gothic War in Italy had causes that began long before the strange summer of 536, and it continued for decades after. But climate shocks can make every existing problem sharper. A long campaign becomes harder when food is scarce. A city becomes more difficult to hold when its population needs feeding. Taxation becomes more bitter when taxpayers have lost crops. A province becomes less stable when local officials are demanding grain from people who are already rationing it at home. And Justinian's empire was demanding a great deal. The government needed revenue for soldiers on the Italian front. It needed ships to cross the Mediterranean. It needed supplies for garrisons in Africa, Sicily, the Balkans and the eastern frontier, where the empire also faced the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire. It needed walls repaired, roads maintained, fortresses provisioned, civil servants paid. It needed the machinery of empire to keep moving. This was not a gentle system even in good years. Imperial taxes could be heavy. Officials were under pressure to meet quotas. Landowners could pass burdens down onto tenants. Communities responsible for delivering grain, animals, labour or money might find themselves trapped between the demands of the state and the reality of a failing harvest. For a wealthy senator in Constantinople, the dimmed sun may have been a strange and unsettling curiosity. For a farmer expected to pay taxes in grain after a poor harvest, it was something else entirely. It was a disaster with an official seal on it. In Italy, the war was already becoming more complicated than Justinian had hoped. The Ostrogoths did not simply disappear after Rome changed hands. They regrouped. They besieged the city in 537. For more than a year, Belisarius and his troops defended Rome, while the Goths tried to cut it off from the outside world. Food was central to the struggle. Armies could fight because supplies arrived. Cities could resist because grain, livestock, and other necessities entered through guarded routes. Control of ports, roads, river crossings, and agricultural districts mattered as much as dramatic battlefield victories. A climate disruption did not create the siege of Rome. But cold crop failure and regional shortage could have made the background conditions of war more brutal. Every delayed shipment mattered more. Every damaged harvest had wider consequences. Every community asked to feed soldiers had fewer reserves to spare. And behind the campaigns was Justinian himself, governing from far away, receiving reports that may have taken weeks to arrive. A victory in Italy, a shortage in one province, a dispute among officials, a request for more money, a report of strange weather, a warning about food prices. An empire can look solid from the capital even while its foundations are under strain. That is the important thing to remember about 536. The Darkened Sky did not topple Justinian's empire. It did not single-handedly decide the fate of Italy. It did not turn every administrative difficulty into collapse. But it arrived at a moment when the empire was stretched outward in almost every direction, spending resources, moving armies, and asking heavily taxed populations to sustain an imperial restoration. And then, as if hunger, cold, war, and financial pressure were not enough, another danger began moving through the same trade routes and crowded cities that held Justinian's world together. A danger carried not by armies or tax collectors, but by disease. In 541, the danger arrived. It seems to have appeared first in Egypt, near the port city of Pelusium on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. From there, according to the historian Procopius, it moved along the coast, reached Alexandria, crossed the sea to Palestine and Syria, and then travelled onward through the roads, harbours, river routes, and trading networks of the Eastern Roman world. By the spring of 542 it had reached Constantinople. This was the Justinianic Plague, named for the emperor who ruled when the first great outbreak swept through the Mediterranean. And for people living through it, the disease must have seemed like the final proof that the world itself had become hostile. First the strange dimness in the sky, then failed harvests and hunger, then war, taxation and shortages, and now a sickness moving from city to city, from port to port, entering the same crowded world that grain ships, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and imperial officials depended on. Procopius was in Constantinople when the plague arrived. He described a city overwhelmed by death. People fell ill with fever, weakness, confusion, and the painful swellings known as buboes, usually appearing in the groin, armpit, or neck. These swellings were so distinctive that later generations would recognize them as one of the classic signs of bubonic plague. His numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Ancient writers often used enormous figures to express horror, and it is difficult to know exactly how many people died in a city with no modern census, no reliable death registry, and bodies accumulating faster than normal burial systems could handle. But the central picture is hard to dismiss. Constantinople was hit by a major epidemic. Officials struggled to organize burials, graves filled. Corpses were carried away in carts, placed in towers, or buried in mass pits when ordinary cemeteries could no longer cope. Trade slowed, work stopped, families lost parents, children, neighbours, servants, colleagues, and friends. A city that depended on constant movement became a place where movement itself could feel dangerous. For a long time, historians debated exactly what disease this was. Ancient descriptions can be vivid, but they are not laboratory reports. Fever and swelling can be caused by more than one infection. Writers may misunderstand what they see, later copyists may alter details, and epidemics have a way of being remembered through fear. But modern science has given the old accounts a remarkable answer. Researchers have recovered fragments of ancient DNA from the teeth and bones of people buried during 6th century plague outbreaks. In some of these victims they found the genetic signature of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, the same species responsible for the Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century. This does not mean every illness in the 6th century was plague. It does not mean every mass grave belonged to plague victims. Archaeology has to be careful about that. But the DNA evidence confirms something important. Yersinia pestis was circulating in Eurasia during the time of Justinian, and it was responsible for at least part of the catastrophe described in the written sources. The first outbreak was only the beginning. The disease returned again and again for roughly 2 centuries in waves that reached parts of the Mediterranean, Europe, the Near East and beyond. Some outbreaks may have been local, others travelled widely. Some communities may have escaped lightly, others may have been devastated. The exact scale remains debated, because surviving records are uneven and because death leaves different archaeological traces in different places. Still, imagine the psychological weight of recurrence. You survive the cold summers. You endure a harvest that barely feeds your family. You watch prices rise. You hear rumours of sickness in a distant port. Then the rumours get closer, and after the sickness passes, it does not vanish from memory. It remains in the empty house beside yours, in the abandoned workshop, in the field that is no longer planted, in the taxes still due from a village with fewer hands to pay them. This is where the story becomes complicated. It is tempting to draw a straight line from the volcanic eruption of 536 to the plague of 541. Volcano darkens sky, cold damages crops, famine weakens people, plague arrives. But history is rarely that neat. We do not yet have proof that the eruption directly caused the Justinianic plague. Yersinia pestis existed in animal populations long before 536. The bacterium has its own ecological history, involving rodents, fleas, climate, landscapes, and the movement of hosts. It did not need an eruption to exist, and disease outbreaks can emerge for reasons that are only partly visible to us now. The older textbook explanation focused on black rats and their fleas. Rats travelled easily in ships, warehouses, granaries, and dense settlements. Fleas feeding on infected rodents could, under the right conditions, transmit the bacterium to humans. That model still has support, especially in port cities connected by Mediterranean trade. But researchers continue to debate the details. Were black rats always the main carriers? Did plague sometimes spread through other rodent species? Could human fleas or lice have helped move the disease rapidly during some outbreaks? How much did regional climate affect the rodent populations that kept the bacterium circulating? These questions matter because plague is not simply a human disease. It is an ecological system. The bacterium survives in relationships between animals, insects, weather, food supplies, and human movement. Change one part of that system, and the consequences may ripple outward in ways nobody can predict. The climate disruption after 536 may have contributed to that unstable world. Colder temperatures and unusual rainfall patterns could have changed crop production, animal habitats, and rodent behaviour. Food shortages may have driven people into closer contact with stored grain, urban markets, and desperate migration routes. Famine may also have made populations more vulnerable, not necessarily by creating plague, but by reducing the reserves people needed to survive any serious illness. And trade, the great strength of Justinian's empire, could become a pathway for disaster. Ships carried grain to hungry cities. They also carried passengers, cargo, rodents, insects, and infection. Roads moved soldiers toward distant wars. They also moved disease toward towns that had never heard of Pelusium. So perhaps the eruption did not cause the plague in any simple sense. But the world the eruption helped create was already stressed, hungry, mobile, and deeply connected. It was a world in which a new epidemic could strike populations with very little margin left. That overlap is what made the decade feel apocalyptic. Not one disaster, several disasters arriving close enough together that people could not separate them. A darkened sun, cold summers, failed crops, expensive food, war, heavy demands from the state, and then death moving through the streets. For many communities, the question was no longer whether life would return to normal. It was whether normal had disappeared for good, and beyond the Mediterranean world in Britain and Northern Europe, other societies were also standing at the edge of profound change. Britain had left the Roman Empire more than a century before the sky turned strange. The legions were gone, imperial taxes had faded. Towns that had once been connected by Roman roads, coins, officials and long-distance trade were changing into something quieter, smaller and more local. But local did not mean isolated. Across Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia and the northern coasts of Europe, communities still moved goods, people, news and marriage partners over remarkable distances. Metal travelled, salt travelled, livestock travelled, ideas travelled. A poor harvest in one valley could become a problem for families far beyond it, especially when the people who normally supplied grain, cattle or tools had troubles of their own. And then came the years after 536. The evidence from northern Europe is not as dramatic as the account of Procopius in Constantinople. There are no surviving eyewitness descriptions of streets filled with plague victims in every region. There is no single document that tells us exactly what happened in every village. Instead, historians find fragments. A settlement that seems to have been abandoned. A farmstead that shrinks. Pollen records showing less cereal cultivation in some areas. Hoards of precious metal buried and never recovered. Changes in burial customs. Hill forts repaired, expanded, or occupied more intensely. Each clue is suggestive. None by itself tells the whole story. But together, in some regions, they hint at a world under pressure. Take Britain. By the 6th century, the old Roman landscape was already breaking apart into small kingdoms and competing territories. In the West, Brittonic-speaking rulers held power in places that had once belonged to Roman provinces. In the East and South, Anglo-Saxon communities were expanding, settling, trading, fighting, and forming new political identities. Further north, in what is now Scotland, Pictish kingdoms were taking shape. Across the Irish Sea, Ireland remained a patchwork of powerful kin groups, monasteries, local kings, and shifting alliances. This was not a stable world waiting peacefully for disaster. It was already a world of change that matters because climate stress does not automatically create political collapse. It does not simply knock over kingdoms like pieces on a board. People make decisions, rulers compete, armies move, alliances hold or fail. A bad harvest can weaken a king, but it can also make his rivals weaker. A community might abandon one farm and establish another somewhere safer. A trading network might collapse in one direction and grow stronger in another. So when we see political transformation in post-Roman Britain, we have to be careful. We cannot say that the volcanic event of 536 caused the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. We cannot say cold summers alone destroyed one people and created another. Those changes had deep roots in migration, warfare, social organisation, and the long aftermath of Roman withdrawal. But climate shock may have added pressure to an already unstable system. Imagine a small kingdom depending on grain from a few productive lowland areas. 1 or 2 poor summers could mean less food for households, fewer animals surviving the winter, and less surplus available to feed warriors, reward followers or support religious communities. A ruler who could normally give gifts, host feasts, and protect his dependents might suddenly have much less to offer. And in early medieval politics, generosity was power. A king was not powerful simply because he wore a crown. He was powerful because people expected him to provide food, land, protection, treasure, judgment in disputes, a place in the social network. When harvests failed, that network could fray. The Irish annals preserve one of the most haunting notices from this period. Under the year 536, later chroniclers recorded a failure of bread. The phrase is brief. Almost painfully brief, no long explanation, no description of starving families, no account of the weather day by day, just the failure of bread. It may refer to crop failure, perhaps from cold, wet weather, shortened growing seasons, or some combination of conditions that made grain difficult to produce. Ireland's annals were compiled and copied long after many of the events they describe, so historians treat them cautiously. Dates can shift, entries can be condensed, a single line may preserve a memory without preserving every detail. But the entry is still important. It suggests that the disruption of the mid-6th century was remembered even at the far western edge of Europe, not as an abstract global climate event, not as volcanic aerosol drifting through the stratosphere, but as bread failing, as the basic expectation that fields would produce food no longer being dependable. Other evidence points in a similar direction, though never with perfect clarity. In parts of northern Europe, archaeologists see signs that settlement patterns changed during the 6th century. Some farmsteads were deserted, some marginal land may have gone out of cultivation. In certain regions, pollen evidence suggests declines in cereal production or a return of woodland, as fields were no longer worked as intensively. But these patterns were uneven. One area may show contraction. Another may show continuity, a coastal settlement with access to fishing, marine mammals, trade or imported goods might endure hardship differently from an inland farming community. A wealthy household with stored grain and cattle could survive a poor year better than a family living close to the edge. Some people may have moved, others may have stayed and changed what they grew, what they ate, or whom they traded with. There was no single northern European experience of 536. For some, it may have meant hunger. For others, anxiety and adaptation. For others still, it may have been remembered only as an unusually dark season, followed by difficult years that blended into the ordinary dangers of early medieval life. And people were not passive. They stored food when they could. Grain, dried meat, dairy products, smoked fish, nuts, and whatever could last through winter. They relied on kin. They exchanged livestock. They moved toward better land, safer coasts, stronger communities, or rulers with fuller storehouses. Monasteries may have become important places of shelter and redistribution, not because they could solve famine everywhere, but because organized communities could gather resources and maintain ties across wider areas. Mobility itself was a survival strategy. A family with relatives in another valley had options. A trader with contacts across the sea had options. A small community tied into networks of marriage, obligation, and exchange had more chances than one standing alone. And that is the strange truth of the 6th century. The same networks that could spread pressure, rumour, and disease could also carry help. A boat arriving from across the Irish Sea might bring news of failed harvests. It might also bring cattle, salt, tools, grain, or a marriage alliance that bound two vulnerable communities together. In the north, as in the Mediterranean, disaster did not create a blank, empty landscape. It accelerated choices, it exposed weaknesses, it rewarded flexibility. And while Britain and Northern Europe struggled through their own uncertain transformations, the crisis was reaching still farther east, across the vast connected world of Eurasia. The crisis was reaching still farther east, across the vast connected world of Eurasia. Beyond the Mediterranean, beyond Britain, beyond the forests and river valleys of Northern Europe, people were also watching the sky, measuring the seasons and discovering that the old patterns were no longer reliable. China had something many parts of Europe did not: a large bureaucratic tradition of record-keeping. Officials reported floods, droughts, eclipses, earthquakes, locusts, frost, failed harvests, and strange appearances in the heavens. Court historians copied these reports into chronicles. Local administrators sent news upward because a disaster was not merely a local inconvenience. It was a matter for the state, and in the political language of early medieval China, it was also a matter for the cosmos. Chinese rulers claimed legitimacy through the mandate of heaven. A dynasty governed because heaven permitted it to govern. But heaven could also send warnings: floods, droughts, comets, unseasonable snow, crop failures, and famine could be interpreted as signs that the balance between ruler, society, and universe had been disturbed. That did not mean every cold spring was understood as proof that an emperor had lost the mandate. But it meant weather mattered politically. A failed harvest was not just a problem for farmers. It could become an argument about whether officials had governed badly, whether taxes had been too severe, whether grain stores had been neglected, whether the ruler had listened to wise advice, or whether heaven itself was expressing displeasure. So when Chinese chronicles describe unusual weather in the years around 536, historians pay close attention. The records are scattered across different states and later historical compilations. They do not give us one perfect, uninterrupted weather diary, but they contain a disturbing pattern of reports: drought in some places, frost at unusual times, snow or cold weather that seemed out of season, crop damage, food shortages, and hunger. In parts of northern China, where agriculture already depended on a narrow window between winter cold and summer heat, a shortened growing season could be devastating. Grain does not care about imperial titles. Millet, wheat, barley, and rice all have limits. Plant too late, and the crop may not mature. Get frost at the wrong moment, and a field that looked promising can become almost worthless. Now imagine this happening after a strange dimming of the sun. Not necessarily total darkness, not a permanent winter, but cooler summers, disrupted rainfall, perhaps a haze in the upper atmosphere, changing how much sunlight reached the ground. A farmer would not know about volcanic aerosols. They would know that the season felt wrong. That seed had gone into the soil. Labour had been spent, hope had risen with the first green shoots, and then the weather had turned against them. The Chinese evidence does not tell us that every province suffered equally. Far from it. China was enormous, and even then it was divided among competing northern and southern regimes. Conditions that brought drought to one region might bring heavy rain somewhere else. A mountain range, a monsoon shift, a river system, or a local storehouse could mean the difference between hardship and catastrophe. But uneven suffering does not make the wider pattern less important. It makes it more human. One district might lose its harvest and send refugees toward a better watered region. Another might still have grain, but see prices rise as merchants and officials bought supplies. A state with functioning granaries could cushion the first shock. A state at war divided by elite rivalries or short of transport animals might find its food stores trapped far from the people who needed them. And 6th century China was already politically fragmented. The Great Northern Wei dynasty had broken apart only a few years before the atmospheric crisis of 536. Northern and southern courts competed. Armies needed grain. Frontier garrisons needed grain. Cities needed grain. In a stable year, feeding soldiers and officials was hard enough. In a bad year, food became strategy. A shortage could weaken a government without destroying it. It could make tax collection harsher. It could push peasants into debt. It could encourage banditry, rebellion, or flight. It could turn a local quarrel over land or water into a violent conflict. And if a ruler could not feed the people, protect the frontier, or keep prices under control, then the language of heaven's displeasure became more than a metaphor. It became political ammunition. Further west across Central Asia, the evidence becomes thinner. There were cities along the Silk Roads, oasis kingdoms dependent on irrigation, merchants moving silk, horses, metals, spices, and religious ideas between China, India, Iran, and the Mediterranean. But there were also immense grasslands, home to pastoralist communities whose wealth moved on four legs. For steppe herders, climate shock could work differently than it did for grain farmers. A cold summer might reduce pasture growth. Drought could dry watering places. A brutal winter after poor grazing could kill sheep, goats, horses, and cattle in large numbers. When herds declined, food declined, transport declined, status declined. A leader who could no longer distribute animals, protect grazing land, or reward followers might lose allies quickly. And on the steppe, people had another option. They could move. Not easily, not safely, not without creating conflict. But movement was built into pastoral life. If one pasture failed, herders searched for another. If a river valley no longer supported enough animals, groups might press toward the territories of their neighbours. That could trigger raids, negotiations, tribute demands, alliances, and wars along frontiers already crowded with competing powers. We should be careful here. There is no simple chain where one volcanic eruption causes one migration, which causes one empire to fall. Eurasian politics were never that neat. Steppe confederations rose and fractured for many reasons: leadership struggles, trade, warfare, tribute, disease, and long-term shifts in military power. But environmental stress may have increased the pressure. It may have made an already tense frontier more volatile. And this is one reason 536 has become so important to historians. The event does not appear to have been a Mediterranean story alone. Tree rings from high northern latitudes show severe cooling. Ice cores preserve evidence of a major eruption. European writers described a weakened sun. Chinese chronicles preserve memories of weather disturbance and food stress. Different languages, different calendars, different political systems, different explanations for why the world had gone wrong, but perhaps the same disturbed atmosphere. Synchronizing these records is difficult. A Chinese chronicle may date an event by an emperor's regnal year. A Byzantine writer may connect it to an indiction cycle. An Irish annal may preserve a later copy of an earlier notice. Even when two sources seem to describe the same year, their calendars may begin in different seasons, and later scribes may have shifted dates. So historians cannot simply line up every mention of frost, hunger, or strange skies and declare a perfect global timeline. But the broad picture is increasingly clear. Something happened on a hemispheric scale. Not every place froze, not every harvest failed, not every society collapsed. But across much of the northern hemisphere, the middle of the 6th century brought a climate shock severe enough to enter chronicles, tree rings, ice, and collective memory. And once food becomes uncertain in one region after another, people begin to do what humans have always done when the land no longer provides enough. They move, but moving is not a single decision. It is not a lever that gets pulled when the weather turns bad. A family does not wake up after one cold summer, look at a grey sky, and suddenly decide to abandon the fields their grandparents cleared, the graves where their ancestors lay, the neighbours who might help them survive the winter. Leaving is expensive. It is frightening. It means giving up local knowledge, familiar water sources, inherited rights to land, and whatever protection a community can provide. So repeated harvest shocks did not make migration inevitable. They made staying harder. That difference matters. One failed crop might be endured. People eat stored grain. They sell livestock. They borrow from relatives. They gather wild foods. They reduce meals. They plant again next year and hope the weather returns to normal. But then imagine another bad season, and another. Seed grain is eaten because there is nothing else. Animals are sold, then slaughtered. Debts grow. A household that once had enough land to feed itself now has to rent labour to a richer neighbour. A village storehouse empties. Merchants raise prices. Officials still demand taxes because armies and cities still need food. At some point, movement begins to look less dangerous than remaining where you are. Not everyone moves far. Some people might go only to the next valley, a market town, a monastery, an estate with better grain stores, or the territory of a lord believed to be more generous. Others could join relatives in another region. Some may have entered towns looking for work, protection, or food, and some, especially people already used to mobile lives on frontiers and grasslands, may have travelled much farther. But every movement has consequences. A district receiving newcomers needs food, land, and shelter. A town already short of grain sees more mouths arriving at its gates. A farming community may fear that strangers will claim fields or pasture. A ruler may see migrants not as victims, but as taxpayers, labourers, soldiers, or a threat to control. And when resources are tight, even small differences can become explosive. A dispute over grazing rights that might once have ended in negotiation can turn violent when animals are starving. A border raid that might once have been a routine act of plunder can become a desperate search for food. A local feud between aristocratic families can widen when both sides need control of grain stores, river crossings, or land that still produces a harvest. This is where it becomes tempting to tell a simple story. The climate changed, people moved, war followed. It is a neat chain. It is also usually too neat. Climate does not make decisions. Volcanoes do not command armies. A cold summer cannot choose whether a king will raise taxes, whether a governor will release emergency grain, whether a city will close its gates, or whether rival leaders will use a shortage to overthrow each other. Those choices were made by people, and 6th century people were already living in a world full of conflicts that had begun long before the skies darkened in 536. The Roman Empire in the east was fighting expensive wars and attempting to rebuild imperial power in the west. Persia was a powerful rival across a heavily militarized frontier. Northern Europe contained competing kingdoms whose borders were never fixed for long. In China, divided states struggled over territory, legitimacy, and access to resources. Across the steppe, alliances formed and broke apart around leaders, trade routes, tribute, and military strength. The atmospheric crisis entered this unstable world like a new weight placed on an already strained structure. Sometimes the structure held. A government with grain reserves, working transport networks, and officials willing to act could soften the blow. Local communities with strong kinship ties might share food and spread risk between households. Regions with different crops, better rainfall, fisheries, forests, or access to trade could survive a poor harvest better than places dependent on one narrow growing season. Sometimes, though, the structure cracked. If grain was available but controlled by wealthy landowners, hunger could become a crisis of distribution rather than absolute shortage. If armies seized food from farmers, the very institutions meant to provide security could deepen misery. If taxes remained fixed while harvests shrank, flight from the land became more likely. If rulers treated displaced people as enemies, movement could create new frontiers of fear. Environmental stress was one force among many, but it was a powerful one because it touched almost everything. Food, prices, health, animal herds, tax revenue, military supply, the authority of rulers. the ability of families to remain where they were, and the pressure did not vanish after one strange year. The climate disturbance of 536 was followed by difficult years in many records. Then, just as communities were trying to recover, another major volcanic event appears in the evidence around 540. For people already living close to the edge, that second blow may have felt like proof that the old world was not coming back, and this is why 540 AD matters so much. If 536 was the first shock, 540 may have been the moment when hope of a quick recovery began to collapse. The evidence comes from the same places that first revealed the scale of the earlier disaster. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica contain another sharp signal of volcanic fallout, around 540 or 541 AD. Layers of ancient ice hold traces of sulfur deposited from the atmosphere, particles and chemicals released when an eruption is powerful enough to send material high into the stratosphere. There, above most weather, sulfur gases can spread across enormous distances. They react with water vapor and form tiny sulfate aerosols. These aerosols reflect a fraction of incoming sunlight back into space. Not enough to turn day into night, but enough to cool the surface of the planet. Enough to weaken summers, enough to shorten growing seasons in places already living close to the agricultural limit. The sulfate spike around 540 is substantial. It suggests another major eruption, perhaps one large enough to produce effects felt well beyond the region where the volcano itself stood. Scientists still debate exactly where it happened. The source may have been in the tropics, where volcanic material can circulate between hemispheres especially effectively. Or it may have come from a high-latitude volcano, whose fallout was concentrated more heavily over one part of the world. The evidence is not yet precise enough to settle every question. But the broader pattern is difficult to ignore. First, a massive atmospheric disturbance around 536. Then another volcanic signal around 540. And between them, tree rings, historical reports, glacier records, and climate reconstructions point toward a long interval of unusually cold and unstable conditions. This is not simply a story of one bad year. It is a story of a decade, perhaps longer, in which the normal expectation that next summer would repair the damage of the last one became increasingly uncertain. Think about what recovery requires. After a failed harvest, a farming family needs a decent year. They need grain enough to eat, but also seed enough to plant. They need fodder for animals weakened by the previous winter. They need labour, tools, and time to repair what scarcity has damaged. They need merchants willing to trade, landlords willing to wait, and local officials who do not demand the same taxes from a much smaller harvest. A single better summer can begin to restore these things. But a second climatic shock arrives before that recovery is complete, and the arithmetic changes. The grain reserves are already low. The livestock herds are already smaller. The seed stock is already compromised. Families who sold land or borrowed food after the first failure have fewer choices after the second. Communities that helped their neighbours once may no longer have enough to help them again. Markets that absorbed one regional shortage can become overwhelmed when shortages spread across several regions at once. This is what historians mean when they speak of cascading hardship. The disaster is not only the cold itself, it is the way one poor season makes the next poor season more dangerous. A weak harvest raises prices. High prices force families to sell assets. Selling assets reduces their ability to produce food next year. Malnutrition weakens bodies and makes disease more severe. Hungry people travel in search of food, placing pressure on towns and regions that may already be struggling. Governments receive less tax revenue just when they need more money for grain relief, military supply and public order. Each problem feeds another, and by the early 5040s, the Eastern Roman Empire was about to confront a catastrophe of another kind, the plague pandemic later associated with Justinian. It would be too simple to say that volcanic cooling caused plague. Disease has its own complex history, involving pathogens, trade routes, animals, human movement, urban conditions, and chance. The first great outbreak of plague in the Mediterranean world cannot be reduced to weather. But a population weakened by repeated scarcity is not the same as a well-fed population with full granaries and stable markets. A state already struggling to supply its cities and armies has fewer reserves when epidemic arrives. A household that has lost children to hunger, animals to winter, and savings to inflated prices has less capacity to survive any new shock. The crises did not need to share a single cause to reinforce one another. That is the unsettling part. For a long time, 536 was often treated as an isolated marvel. The year when the sun dimmed, the year when summer failed. A strange episode at the edge of recorded history. But increasingly, historians and climate scientists are looking at the 53s and 5040s as one connected crisis period, not because every region experienced exactly the same weather. They did not because every society collapsed. They did not, and not because volcanic eruptions explain every war, migration, epidemic, or political change that followed. They cannot, but because the evidence suggests that communities across much of the Northern Hemisphere faced repeated environmental stress during years when the political world was already dangerously unstable. The volcanic event around 540 may have interrupted recovery from 536, or in some places reversed it completely. A village that had survived the first cold summers by drawing down its stores might have entered the early 540s with nothing left to draw down. A kingdom that had endured temporary shortage could find that temporary had become normal. A generation of people who expected hardship to pass might begin to understand that the seasons themselves had become unreliable. And that changes behavior. People delay marriages. They sell land. They leave villages. They raid neighbours. They hoard grain. They blame rulers. They seek protection from monasteries, landlords, military commanders, or anyone who seems able to control food and safety. The darkened sky of 536 was terrifying because it was unfamiliar. The second blow was worse in another way. By 540, people may have understood that the first disaster was not over, and somewhere perhaps on an island, perhaps beneath a mountain now quiet, perhaps in a volcanic landscape whose history has been partly erased by later eruptions, the source of that second shock was waiting to be identified. So can we name the volcano that darkened the sky in 536? The honest answer is, not yet. And that may seem frustrating. Scientists can drill nearly 2 miles into Greenland ice, identify a thin layer of volcanic debris deposited almost 1,500 years ago, measure traces of sulfur smaller than a grain of dust, and compare them with ash from eruptions around the world. But naming one mountain, one crater, one violent day in the year 536 remains difficult. The strongest conclusion is not that we know exactly which volcano erupted. The strongest conclusion is that a major volcanic event, or perhaps more than one event close together, injected enormous quantities of material into the atmosphere at precisely the time the historical and climate evidence says the world began to cool. That much is increasingly hard to dismiss. The question is where. For many years, Iceland has been one of the leading suspects. And on a map, it makes a certain kind of sense. Iceland sits in the North Atlantic, directly beneath the storm tracks and atmospheric circulation patterns that connect the Arctic with Europe. A major Icelandic eruption could spread ash and sulfur across the northern hemisphere, affecting the regions where written sources describe the strange sun, the failed summers, and the prolonged cold. Iceland is also one of the most volcanically active places on Earth. It lies on the mid-Atlantic ridge, where tectonic plates pull apart, and above a plume of unusually hot material rising from deep within the mantle. The island is, in geological terms, a place built by fire. Its landscape is full of evidence: vast lava fields, buried ash layers, craters hidden beneath moss, glaciers concealing active volcanoes. Some eruptions there have been so large that they changed the course of rivers, blanketed farms in ash, and sent haze across Europe. So when researchers began finding evidence for a huge 6th century volcanic disturbance, Iceland was an obvious place to look. Several Icelandic volcanic systems have been proposed. Katla, buried beneath the Myrdalsjökull ice cap, is often mentioned because it has produced major explosive eruptions in the past. Other candidates include volcanoes in the Vatnajökull region, where ice-covered eruptions can be especially violent. There are also older Icelandic eruption deposits that may correspond roughly to the right period. Though matching dates across different records is not always simple, but obvious is not the same as proven. A volcano does not leave behind a signed confession. What it leaves is ash, tiny fragments of shattered volcanic glass, sometimes smaller than a human hair. These particles are called tephra. When they settle onto an ice sheet, sink into a lake, or become trapped in peat bogs, they can survive for centuries or even millennia, and each volcanic eruption produces tephra with its own chemical character. Not perfectly unique, perhaps, but often distinctive enough to narrow the search. Imagine a volcanic ash particle as a microscopic fingerprint. Scientists measure its glass chemistry, the proportions of silica, aluminum, iron, calcium, potassium, sodium, titanium, and other elements locked into the glass when magma was suddenly blasted apart and cooled in the air. An eruption from Iceland may have one chemical signature. An eruption from Alaska may have another. A volcano in Kamchatka, the Aleutian Islands, Japan, or the Andes may produce ash with a different combination again. Researchers take particles from an ice core layer dated to around 536. Then they compare those particles with samples from known volcanic deposits around the world. If the chemistry matches, the case becomes stronger. If it does not match, a candidate can be ruled out. Simple in principle, extremely difficult in practice. The ash layer in an ice core may contain only a few particles. Some may be broken, some may have been altered by acidic conditions in the ice. The original eruption deposit near the volcano may itself be buried beneath younger lava flows, washed away by glaciers, or simply never studied in enough detail. And then there is the problem of timing. Dating a volcanic deposit is not always as precise as people imagine. Ice cores can be counted year by year, especially when several records are compared. Tree rings can anchor climate events to exact calendar years. But deposits near a volcano may be dated with radiocarbon ranges, historical estimates, or layers of soil that provide a window of decades rather than a single year. An ash bed might be described as 6th century. That is useful. But 6th century is a long time when the question is whether an eruption happened in 536, 537, or 540. Sulfur adds another clue. Volcanic eruptions release sulfur dioxide gas. If that gas reaches the stratosphere, it can remain there for months or years, reacting with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols. Those aerosols scatter sunlight and help explain the cooling seen in tree rings and historical reports. Ice cores preserve the sulfur fallout from those aerosols. Scientists can measure how much sulfur arrived in Greenland, Antarctica, or both. They can compare the timing, size, and distribution of those sulfate spikes. A strong signal in Greenland and a weaker one in Antarctica may point toward a high-latitude northern hemisphere eruption. A large signal in both hemispheres may suggest a tropical source where stratospheric circulation can spread volcanic material much more widely. For the event around 536, much of the evidence has pointed toward a northern hemisphere source, possibly at high latitude, that keeps Iceland near the centre of the investigation. But it does not place Iceland beyond doubt. Some researchers have considered volcanic regions in North America, including Alaska and the Aleutian Arc. Others have looked toward the far North Pacific, toward Kamchatka, or other volcanic zones capable of producing huge explosive eruptions. There may even have been more than one eruption contributing to the atmospheric disturbance recorded in the 530s. That possibility matters. When people picture the disaster of 536, they often imagine one volcano exploding once, then a dark cloud circling the planet. Reality may have been messier. An eruption could have occurred late in 535, with sulfur aerosols spreading through 536. Another eruption may have followed. Different ice cores may record different parts of the same atmospheric event. A high-latitude eruption could have caused severe regional cooling, while another volcano, elsewhere, added more sulfur to an already disturbed climate system. Nature does not organize itself around the clean chapters historians prefer. Still, the evidence for volcanic forcing is much firmer than the identity of the volcano. That distinction is important. We do not need to know the mountain's name to recognize what happened in the atmosphere. The ice records show volcanic sulfate, the tree rings show cold summers, the historical witnesses describe a weakened sun and failed harvests. Climate models show that a large stratospheric injection of sulfur can produce the kind of cooling pattern reconstructed for these years. These are separate lines of evidence, produced by separate natural archives, pointing toward the same broad explanation. Volcanoes were involved. Which volcano exactly remains the mystery, and that mystery may not last forever. New ice cores are being drilled with cleaner methods and finer resolution. Laboratories can now isolate and analyze volcanic glass particles so small that earlier researchers could barely detect them. Mass spectrometers can measure isotopes of sulfur, tiny variations in sulfur atoms that may help reveal whether material was injected high into the stratosphere, where it could influence climate on a hemispheric scale. Researchers are also building larger chemical databases of ash from volcanoes across Iceland, Alaska, Russia, and other volcanic regions. Every newly mapped eruption deposit is another possible fingerprint added to the archive. Some future team may find a buried layer of ash beside an Icelandic glacier, date it securely to the mid-530s, and discover that its chemistry matches the particles trapped in Greenland ice. Or they may find that the match points somewhere else entirely. For now, the mountain remains unnamed, but its consequences do not. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, a volcano or a sequence of volcanoes may have thrown enough sulfur into the upper atmosphere to weaken the sun over empires, farms, forests, and distant villages. The people living beneath that dimmed sky could not have known where it began. They only knew that summer had changed, and more than 1,000 years later we are still following the dust back toward the fire. Following that dust back toward the fire is only part of the work. Because reconstructing the year 536 is not like opening a diary and reading what happened day by day. It is more like rebuilding a shattered window from fragments found in different places. One piece comes from a Byzantine historian writing that the sun gave little light. Another comes from a Chinese chronicle describing frost, failed crops, or strange weather. Another is buried in Greenland ice, a thin chemical signal left by sulfur falling from an ancient sky. Another survives in the rings of a tree that endured a summer too cold to grow properly. None of these pieces tells the whole story alone. Together, they begin to form a picture. This is how modern science reconstructs a 6th century year. Not by trusting one source completely, but by asking whether many different kinds of evidence, created in different ways and preserved in different places, point toward the same event. The written sources provide the human experience. They tell us what people noticed. A dim sun, a haze that lasted for months, crops that did not ripen, snow or frost arriving at the wrong time, hunger, fear, sudden changes in the price of food. But chronicles have limits. A writer may exaggerate. A text may survive only in copies made centuries later. Some regions had literate elites who recorded disasters. Others had no surviving written record at all, and a person in Constantinople could describe a strange sky over the eastern Mediterranean without knowing whether people in Ireland, China, or Central Asia were seeing the same thing. So historians compare sources. If writers separated by thousands of miles describe unusual darkness or failed harvests around the same time, that becomes harder to dismiss as local rumour. If those reports match evidence from nature, the reconstruction grows stronger. That is where ice cores enter the story. Deep beneath Greenland and Antarctica, snow has fallen year after year, eventually compressing into ice. Each layer traps a small sample of the atmosphere. Volcanic sulfate, wind-blown dust, sea salt, traces of pollution from later industrial centuries, all of it becomes part of the frozen archive. Around the middle of the 6th century, ice cores show major volcanic signals. That does not tell us exactly what a farmer saw in a particular village, but it tells us that something happened in the atmosphere on a scale large enough to leave chemical evidence near the poles. Then come the trees. Trees do not write chronicles, but they do keep calendars. In favourable years, a tree may add a broad ring. In cold or dry years, growth slows and the ring becomes narrow. In some extreme cases, the tree barely grows at all. By matching the patterns of living trees with older timber from buildings, buried forests, and archaeological sites, scientists can build timelines reaching back thousands of years. And in those timelines, the years after 536 stand out. Across parts of Europe, Asia, and North America, tree rings record severely reduced summer growth. The signal is not identical everywhere. Climate never behaves with perfect symmetry. But the broad pattern suggests unusually cold conditions lasting beyond one bad season. Ice tells us there was volcanic material in the atmosphere. Trees tell us summers became colder. Chronicles tell us people struggled beneath a weakened sun. Archaeology adds another layer. Abandoned farms, changes in settlement patterns, evidence of disrupted trade, shifts in diet, hoards buried and never recovered. These clues cannot always be tied directly to one volcanic year. Human societies are complicated. Wars, taxes, epidemics, local droughts, and political collapse can all change where people live and what they leave behind. But archaeology can show the pressure building on the ground. Finally, climate models test whether the pieces make physical sense. Scientists feed estimates of volcanic sulfur into computer models of the atmosphere and oceans. Then they ask a simple question. If a major eruption placed this much material high in the stratosphere, would the result look anything like the climate evidence? Could sunlight weaken? Could temperatures fall most sharply across parts of the northern hemisphere? Could summers become short, wet, or cold enough to damage harvests? The models do not replay the past perfectly. They are not time machines. They depend on assumptions about the size of eruptions, winds, ocean conditions, and the climate system already in motion. But when their results resemble the cooling recorded in tree rings and the disturbances described in historical texts, that is another piece of support. Not proof in the courtroom sense, something more patient, convergence, independent archives agreeing on the broad shape of a disaster. Still, uncertainty remains everywhere. The exact date of an eruption may differ by months depending on how ice layers are counted. A cold summer in one region may have been a wet summer somewhere else, or even a relatively ordinary year beyond the reach of the volcanic haze. We cannot know precisely how many people starved, migrated, or died from diseases made worse by hunger. Population estimates for the 6th century are especially uncertain. Many rural communities left almost no records. A failed harvest may have been survivable for a wealthy city with grain reserves, but fatal for a village already living close to the edge. And that is not a failure of science. It is science being honest about the difference between what the evidence shows and what we wish it could show. The story of 536 has changed repeatedly as new ice cores, better tree ring chronologies, and improved climate models have appeared. Earlier explanations are revised, dates are refined. Old theories are weakened and new possibilities emerge. That is not the story falling apart. That is the story becoming clearer. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of 536. Complex societies can look permanent right up until the moment nature exposes their weaknesses. Fields depend on seasons. Cities depend on fields. Armies, markets, taxes, and imperial power all depend, in the end, on enough food arriving at the right time. When the sun dimmed and summer failed, even the greatest empires discovered how thin that margin could be. The darkened sky did not destroy every society at once, but it revealed how quickly a natural shock could turn an ordinary year into a struggle for survival. And when the strange sky finally began to clear, the crisis did not simply end. That is one of the hardest parts of this story to hold in mind. A volcanic veil may last months, perhaps a few years in its strongest form. Sulfate particles slowly settle out of the upper atmosphere. Sunlight returns. Summers become brighter again, but people do not recover as quickly as skies do. A failed harvest is never just one failed harvest. It means seed grain has been eaten. It means animals have been slaughtered because there is no fodder for winter. It means families have sold tools, land, or possessions to buy food at prices they could barely afford. It means children who survived hunger may remain weakened for years. It means a village that lost half its workers has less ability to plant, build, trade, or defend itself when the next bad season arrives. And after 536, there were more bad seasons. The evidence points not to a single mysterious dark year, neatly isolated from everything around it, but to a longer period of cooling and instability. Another major volcanic event around 540 appears in ice core records, and tree rings suggest that parts of the northern hemisphere remained unusually cold through much of the following decade. For people living through it, there may have been no clear dividing line between disaster and ordinary life. There was simply the memory of the sun losing its strength. Then the fear of another poor harvest. Then rumours from distant towns that grain had become expensive, that refugees were arriving, that disease was spreading, that armies were moving, that something in the natural order had changed. This is why 536 has become such a powerful date in history. Not because every person alive that year experienced the same darkness, the same cold, or the same suffering. They did not. Climate is local. Wealth is local. Politics are local. A farmer in northern Europe, a merchant in Constantinople, a court official in China, and a herder on the Central Asian steppe lived in very different worlds. Some communities had stored food, some could trade for grain. Some benefited from local weather patterns that were less severe than elsewhere. Some regions may have suffered more from drought or flooding than cold. Others may have escaped the worst effects altogether. And yet, across so much of Eurasia, The signs of stress appear again and again. The dimmed sun, the cold summers, the harvest failures, the hunger, the movement of people under pressure. The political strain placed on kingdoms and empires already dealing with war, taxation and rivalry. Then, in the middle of this fragile recovery, came plague. It would be too simple to say that one eruption caused every crisis of the 6th century. History does not work like that. Volcanoes do not create empires, start every war, or spread every disease. But they can make an already difficult world much more dangerous. They can reduce the margin for error until one failed crop, one harsh winter, one outbreak of illness becomes a catastrophe. Behind every narrow tree ring was a summer someone tried to survive. Behind every line of sulfate in an ice core was a sky breathed beneath by millions of people who never knew why it had changed. Behind every chronicle describing famine or frost were households making impossible choices. Whether to save seed for spring or feed it to hungry children. Whether to leave home or remain. Whether to sell the last animal. Whether help would arrive before winter. Most of their names are gone. But the evidence they left behind remains in strange and scattered forms. In ice from Greenland, in ancient trees, in volcanic glass buried far from its source, in the careful, worried words of people who looked upward and saw a sun that no longer seemed like itself. And scientists are still finding new pieces, a refined ice core date, a shard of volcanic glass that may narrow the search for an eruption, a better tree ring record from a region once missing from the map. Each discovery can change the story a little. It may help identify the volcano, or it may reveal that the 6th century climate crisis was even more complicated than we thought. The mystery is not fully solved, but perhaps that is fitting. The people of 536 did not know they were living through a global climate event. They only knew that the seasons had become unreliable, that food had become scarce, and that the familiar world felt suddenly uncertain. More than 14 centuries later, we are still listening for their voices in the cold archives of the earth. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into one of history's darkest years, please like, comment and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is waiting for you in the description. For now, thank you for spending this time with history. Rest well.